Hello, and thank you for joining us today at the Bramble Patch. My name is Wendy, and on Technicals today we've got Alicia. Today we are going to be looking at doing a shadow box quilt. Now, it's called a shadow box quilt, but it can quite easily be a wall hanging. It's quite effective. So behind me we've got two hanging. So this is one of the shop samples that we have, and this one is done with a square with the shadow in a very dark charcoal grey. This one is my daughter's, and Claire has decided to do the rectangles. Now, this has been done out of collection fabric that Claire particularly liked, but Claire didn't want to do anything with dark grey or black because this actually hangs in Claire's hallway. So she's done her shadow in an olive green. Now, as long as the shadow is generally a darker fabric, it actually will showcase the blocks that you're actually putting into it. And that works really nicely. Now, to use a collection of fabric, so it could be one of your favourite designers, a particular collection, and it works really nicely. You can use any size you want to. There's just generally a couple of rules, and I'll go through those with you shortly. The other thing you can do, you can actually use panels. So you get really nice panels at the moment. Quite often, if it's a panel with one picture on it or one design, you tend to use those more for attic windows, which is a particular favourite of mine. But you can have panels that have individual squares on them. And these work equally as well. I don't generally use novelty fabrics myself, but we did have a couple of panels come in that were really nice, and I thought this would be nice to do for my new grandson. So I actually purchased a couple of panels, and I've done this. As you can see, it's got like little sea creatures on it, and the shadow on mine is like a petrol blue. I wanted to keep it in keeping, so it's a bit more like water, and I think it's actually working quite nicely. Very, very simple to do. The whole of this took me about 2.5, maybe 3 hours at an absolute push. Goes together really, really quickly. So let's just take a look and see how you do it. So you make your blocks quite simply, and this is one block. So first of all, what I did, I actually cut all of my blocks out. Now, I did want mine to be the same size. So I have actually cut the blocks. Let's see, there we go. So all my blocks are the same size, and these are measuring 8¼ inches. You need to decide whether you want your shadow to come from the right or the left. On this occasion, I've done my shadow to be on the right-hand side. So all you need to do is actually measure the length of the right-hand edge. So if I take my ruler and just measure that, and that actually measures 8¼ Now, the strips that we're going to put down the side need to be cut 1½ inches wide, so they finish up 1 inch in width. You can cut them wider if you choose to, but if you do them much wider, you tend to lose the effect of it being shadow. You don't want it too chunky unless you're doing really, really big oblongs, blocks, squares, whichever way you want to do it. So generally, you cut the strips 1½ inches wide. Now, the top square, I think I have one here. No, this one. There we go. So the square here will be cut 1½ inches square. Okay. So once that's added in, it will measure 1¼ inches. So you need to work out what the rest of the length is remaining, plus your 1/4 inch seam allowance, because you're going to lose 1/4 of an inch from both the 1.5 inch square and from the length of the shadow strip. Okay, so once you've worked all that out, instead of making each strip individually like so, that takes a long time. So it's much easier to work out how many you're going to need and add that width together. So for instance, if they're 1.5 inches wide and I only wanted 4, then you would only want 6 inches in width, but I would do it 7 by the length of the strip itself. Now, when you construct this, you are only going to put them to one side. So you'll need one of those strips for every block for the side and one from the bottom edge of every one. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to make those strips. So I've already cut my fabric and I've got a 1.5 inch width strip. So I'm going to lay that along the edge and I'm just going to sew all the way along here. Okay. So once this is sewn, this will then be the length of the side of the block I'm going to add it to. I've already got my machine switched on and I've got a little thread saver in here so that I don't get any spaghetti or threads going on underneath, and it will just sail straight the way through. It's a very simple way to ensure that your machine is not going to all lock up and catch. So do that, and oops, I'll just sew another one onto the edge there. Okay. Snip that off. And that one. Okay, so all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to set the seam, just give that a little press to warm it through, and I'm going to press the seam to the dark side, just so that we don't see the seam through the lighter fabric. Because on this occasion, it doesn't matter which way they go. Obviously, I'm saying the shadow is going to be darker than the corner square, the background fabric. Right, so I've already got that made now. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to cut this edge just to tidy it up a little bit. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'll make sure that it doesn't matter what line, any line is on my sew line, just here, and make sure that also the bottom edge is straight the way along and not at an angle. We don't want to start off at an angle. We want it all nice and straight. So there we go. Take that edge off. And then I'm going to cut my strips 1.5 inches wide. Now, if you want to, when you do this seam, you can actually reduce the width of your stitch a little bit if you want, so that when you cut it, it doesn't actually come unravelled. Generally, when I'm doing something like this, I'm going to be sewing it straight away. But if you choose to reduce the width of that stitch, just remember to reset your machine back to the original setting once it's done. Okay, so I'll just set those aside. So now I've got some strips. Now I've already got cut my other ones. So here we go. One. There it is. There we go. So what I'm going to do now is my shadow is to the right hand side. So I'm going to sew this strip to the right hand side making sure that the light square, the background square, is to the top right-hand corner, because this needs to merge into the background. So I'm just going to roll that over, make sure you've got your block in the right orientation, if it's a directional fabric or it has a design on it. And I'm just going to quickly sew that down. Speed that up a little bit. Okay. Right, so I've sewn that on. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to press it to into the block and not to the edge, because what I want to do is eliminate the bulk on this section just here. And it will just help ease that over, like so. Some threads coming through there, because I cut some of these earlier. And there we go. Snip those off, like so. I don't want threads everywhere. I prefer to actually just tidy things up as I go along, if need be. Okay. So I'm just going to tidy that up a little bit there. So what we need to do now is actually put the piece on the bottom. So you construct the bottom in exactly the same way as we've done the side. But what you need to remember is, although this was the same size because it was a square, we now have an additional 1 1/4 inch width. It was 1 1/2, but we've lost 1/4 inch because of the seam allowance. So we need to add that on. So you make those in exactly the same way. And this is going to be sewn on to the bottom edge. Now, once again, make sure if you have a right-hand shadow, your background corner square needs to be to the left-hand side. If you choose to do the left-hand shadow, then you need your background square to the right-hand side. So I'm just going to roll that over, and I'm just going to sew that on very quickly. This is one of those techniques that, you know, you might only ever do it once. Some people get totally hooked. Quite often, if you like sort of more arty things around the home, or if you tend to do things for children, it's another nice way of actually doing something very personal for them. There we go. Just off. Okay. There we go. So I just a little press, and I'm just going to roll that in to the center once again. Now, with something like this, quite often I would possibly custom quilt it. So I wouldn't press my seams open, because that would eliminate the chance of me doing stitch in the ditch. Because to do stitch in the ditch, you must have the seam pressed to one side or the other, not open, otherwise you would just be sewing through thread and it would weaken your work. So we now have a block that has the side and the bottom. So what we need to do now is we need to look at how we join them together. Now, if you take a look at at this quilt, you'll see that mine is going to be 3 squares across and X amount down. Now, you only add the background sashing to the inner blocks. So you'll notice that I haven't added one to this side, because when it's all finished, I will add a strip to the left and to the right, and then across the top and the bottom. That way you haven't got as many seams, and it's actually more pleasing to the eye. So it's just eliminating unnecessary seams, and then you don't have to match anything up either. So you will only put insertions of the background in between here. Now, you can do the width whatever you want to on those. I didn't want this too wide because I know where this is going to be hung. So I chose to do cut it at 2 inches wide. So it finishes up 1.5 inches once I've lost my seam allowance. Okay. So if I just set that to one side there, and I have another one here already, I think. So this one and this one. These are the 2 blocks that I have made already. Do make sure you have them in the correct orientation when you sew them together. So the strip that I need to add, this is going to be an end one. So I don't want to add one here. I will only add one here and in between this one and the one that goes next to it. So here is where I need to add a 2-inch strip of fabric, which is going to be the background. So just to make sure, you can always do your sums and make sure everything's all adds up, but as a double check, you can just measure that, and that actually measures 9 1/4. So all I need to do now is cut, oops, a 9 1/4 inch strip of fabric by 2 inches. I've already cut it to 2 inches, and I'm going to lay this on my cutting board. I haven't got my square ruler in with me, so I'm laying it on my cutting board and I'm putting the edge of this, let me see, oops, here. I'm putting the edge of the fabric to the 0 edge on my cutting board. I will then place my ruler, make sure that when you've got this edge here, you've got the fabric flush straight along the line on your cutting mat. I will then go to 9 1/4 inches, just get rid of those, on my cutting board. And that's really easy to see, because once you've lined up your 1/4 inch on the bottom, the 1/4 inch line on the ruler will settle itself on one of the darker lines. So obviously your widths will vary depending on what size you actually do. So that is now the correct size. And what I need to do now is actually sew this to the edge. There we go. Right, so let's take that one and pop it on here. This fabric is a very, very pale turquoise, and if you're not careful, it's very easy to get it upside down. So I always have to double check with this one. It's very much like using a white on white. It's very easy to mistake which way round you actually have it. I seem to have very large pieces of thread savers today. There we go. Okay, So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give it a little press. Now on this occasion, I like to actually press this to the actual background fabric because it's helping eliminate bulk, and it'll sit much more flush actually once it's quilted. Thread there. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, we have this one. And what we're going to do now is we're going to add this one here. Make sure that you've got the blocks the right way round, because what we want is the sashing in between. So as you can see, you're going, if I can just hold this up, I'm hoping you can see it. Lucia's going to help me, thank you, Lucia. So we're going shadow, background, block. If you check that each time you do it, you know that everything's going. If you've got somewhere to lay it out, it's brilliant. I haven't got a lot of space here, so that's what I check. So shadow, background, block. So I'm just going to turn this round to face me so I can double check. Shadow, background, block. So I'm just going to roll that over and just sew that down there. And as you can see, it really does go together really quickly. Of course, you can make these any size you want, whether it's to go on a bed or a wall, whatever you want to do. If you have an embroidery machine, there's no reason why you can't actually embroider the blocks themselves. They actually become the feature fabric. So once again, I'm just going to press that in to the background fabric, like so. And hopefully now you can see how quickly that's gone together. So here, if I was to sew this one on, I could sew that one onto there and I'd have a continual row. All I would need to do then is add another sashing along the bottom, 2 inches straight the way along, and then join this row to it. Once that's done, if that was the size I wanted it to be with no more blocks added, I would add a border to the side, top and bottom. And on these quilts, you can see, let me get rid of the chair. So on this one, it's got the background fabric and then it's got an extra border as well. On this one, it's just got a much wider background fabric. Both work equal as well. No rules or regulations. Do whatever suits the fabric that you have, and you might want it to go in a particular area on the wall, in an alcove, in a bedroom, whatever. So just make it work for yourself. It's something very personal. They make lovely, lovely gifts. I have really enjoyed making these, and sometimes you get the panels and not quite sure what to do with them, or a particular range of fabric and can't bear to actually cut it up because you like the way it looks in the first place. So this is a way that you can actually keep it, particularly if you've got somewhere that you can hang a wall hanging to just showcase your favoured collections. So thank you for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. Thank you from myself, Alicia, and the rest of the Bramble Babes. Bye-bye for now.